Okay, we are back for part two, labor and politics. And I only have a few more slides to show you, but I didn't want to get abruptly interrupted when we hit the 60-minute point, which is what VoiceThread does. It automatically stops. Um, so it is Labor Day. Again, I just want to make that point. And it's a good time for us to think about the situation for labor unions, working class organization in the United States. So I hope that you will find some of the ideas and information here to be useful as you think about this important topic. Nothing significantly will change in the United States without some form of labor organization. And obviously that would be um, even more ideal, would be even more ideal if we had a labor party. More about that. Okay, so let's continue. Um, and I am showing you the cover of a report that was done. And it was a way to, I think, challenge to some extent um, ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and the effort by ALEC to expand the number of states that were considering a right to work legislation. Now, this was done some time ago. There's actually more right to work states that have been added since then. Um, but I do want to show you a few of the tables they produced. Um, Before I do that, I want to mention again, and this is something that you'll be reading about. I made reference to it already in part one, the significance of having a right to work law or not in relationship to how it impacts the politics of that state. And these researchers, from the bargaining table to the ballot box, political effects of right to work laws, they were looking at the difference between adjacent counties on the border, trying to control for some of the characteristics of the population. And one county was in a state that is right to work, and the other county is in a state that is not right to work. And looking at the differences between those counties in terms of the direction of the vote, the presidential level, and at the state level, and state level races. And also the difference in turnout, that is, the percentage of the population that actually participates. And so this is a really, really powerful demonstration of the mobilizing effect of having union representation of workers in your state, and also clearly the effect that the right to work law has on diminishing that positive, progressive political mobilization impact that union organizations generate. So I wanted to share that with you. There's been some great studies. These are just a few that have been done recently on this question. This is another one. Let me move my screen so I can see everything. Let's see, I'll move it over. Yeah, I'll move it over there. Okay. Um, and this just focuses on something that's a little different, not necessarily the political consequences, but the consequences of having or not a right to work law on the safety and health of workers in those states. And again, the point is that when you mobilize workers around issues that are related to workplace conditions, you mobilize workers around progressive legislation that is the result of the education they receive in their labor unions. It has a direct impact on the physical safety of workers in those states. So this is just another connection we can make between having or not a right to work law, the impact that has on unions, and ultimately the impact it has on workers, safety, health, income, etc. These are states that have passed laws. 2011, 2012, there was a surge of efforts by states. This is the period when Republican legislatures in the states were in high gear, and it shows you where some of the efforts and action was taking place. Now, this comes from that a report by the Center for American Progress that also wanted to highlight some of the issues and consequences associated with the right to work movement. And you can see that the top 10 states by level of unionization versus the bottom 10 states, having a unionized labor force makes an enormous difference in terms of the level of social welfare benefits, government assistance, and forms of protection for workers. Here's health insurance coverage, voter turnout, which we've focused on, which you'll be reading more about as well. And what has been happening over the last 4 years under the Trump administration? Let's remember that Trump did run focusing on issues related to workers' declining economic prospects, deindustrialization, the impact of trade pacts like the North American Free Trade, NAFTA, Free Trade Act, and the impact that has on workers losing their jobs in manufacturing, et cetera. So he promoted himself in some ways as a kind of populist, mobilizing workers around those issues. It was a very, very smart move on his part. And the Democrats have been outmaneuvered constantly on this because they seem reluctant to talk about the working class. But in any case, what has actually happened under Trump, not what was the rhetoric that he used to get elected, but what actually has been the policy impact of his administration. And again, I mentioned the National Labor Relations Board is the board that essentially enforces and ensures that there are in place protections for workers. This report, and if you're interested in following all kinds of developments in the area of the state of the American working class, definitely go to the American Policy Institute. You will find enormous amounts of data, and they have reports that they generate periodically. One that came out recently titled Unprecedented, the Trump's National Labor Relations Board's attack on workers' rights. And they go into an enormous amount of detail, highlighting all of the changes that have been made. And by the way, nobody ever pays attention to this. They pay attention to all the crazy, bullshit, idiotic statements made by the president. That gets all the press attention. In the meantime, while we're all distracted by that, we have the rollback of all kinds of policies and regulations meant to protect workers. They're being scrapped. They're being rolled back. And very few people are paying attention to this. So the Economic Policy Institute put out this report that highlights what's happening. These are some headlines: Trump's anti-worker agenda, President Trump's regulatory rollback, an attack on Americans' wallets, because obviously it translates into how much money people can make, and the protection rules that exist under the National Labor Relations Board, and they have been also weakened. Wage theft, the ability to form unions. His trade policies have actually had a negative effect on workers, despite the rhetoric, and worker safety and health has also been compromised. Take a look at the report by the Economic Policy Institute if you're interested. Very valuable stuff. And this is just more connections on that same theme. One thing to think about when we argue for government-mandated minimum wage, which I am supportive of and which has not been increased, at least the federal minimum wage has not been increased in many, many, many years, so it should be. And I'm fine for a 15-hour minimum wage. I don't really have an issue with that, except that imposing that requirement is more difficult for some businesses than for others. So you sometimes ask yourself, Should the wage levels of workers be mandated by the government? And there's good, solid arguments for that, and I support the minimum wage. But another way to think about this is, would it be better if rather than we had the government mandating one wage for all workers, if workers in every workplace were given the right to organize into a labor union, to collectively bargain for themselves? They could sit down with managers, they could sit down with owners, and they could determine what would be a fair wage in the context of that organization, that business, the amount of profit that that particular organization makes. Some corporations can easily pay workers $15 an hour without any loss to a significant amount of their profit. There are other businesses where this might be more problematic. You also would then have workers organized into labor unions, mobilized, educated, raising levels of class consciousness, participating more in politics than just the mandated minimum wage. So I'm not saying that I'm opposed to the minimum wage. I'm just saying we should think about other ways that workers in the workplace, organizationally, through political action, can impact the amount of money they're paid, the conditions of work, the terms and conditions of employment, as we like to say. Okay, I always like to show the vicious death cycle that we find ourselves in. I pointed to this politically in terms of neoliberalism. You can see the same thing here, the death spiral. You have declining levels of unionization. That weakens worker political mobilization. That means you're not going to have pro-labor policies being pursued by the parties because workers are not mobilized, they're not energized, they're not possessed with a kind of level of a consciousness, these norms of equity. That means that there's going to be an absence of progressive countervailing power against the concentration of corporate power. Anti-union policies will continue to be rolled forward, and more declining unionization, weaker political mobilization, weaker pro-labor orientation. You see what's happening here. Okay, this is the cycle we have been in for the past 20 to 30 years. And the only way this can be broken is to have significant, serious labor reform that ensures and encourages and facilitates the ability of workers, if they so desire, to organize labor representation in their place of work. I just finished a book I came across last month. Fabulous, unbelievably excellent analysis of labor and politics. Massive references to literature on almost every aspect of the labor movement in the United States, the relationship between the labor movement and political organizations. And what this writer does, this researcher, this scholar, is he wants to explain why the level of unionization, labor power, is so much weaker in the United States than in Canada. So he's doing a comparative analysis, which is a really fascinating way to approach this problem. And he says, Canada and the United States, they have a lot of similar characteristics. So if you're, comparing the United States with European countries that have 80% unionization, it's a tougher comparison. And so they have a similar kind of history in terms of the introduction of labor organization. But why is it that today the percentage of workers in Canada that are a member of a union is so much higher than it is in the United States, and they have significantly more power, labor unions in Canada? That's the question. And there's been a lot of research done on this question, a lot of hypotheses posed, a lot of explanations offered, and he goes through all of them. And he shows with data those that seem to have support and those that don't. So it's a rigorous analysis of this question. And I'm only going to give you the punchline. But if you're interested, check out his writings, pick up the book, or I'm sure you can find some articles he's published that essentially have much of what he has put together in this book that I just finished. Now, one interesting thing that he observes historically, the rise of labor unions around the same time in both of these countries. How did the ruling class, the political system, what he calls the ruling part, how did they respond to the demand for wider levels of labor organization and labor activity at the point of production in the workplace, as well as in the political system? Now, the United States has the lowest level of unionization and a much lower level than Canada. But here's the paradox. He says that US labor was met at the time with a more welcoming, pro-labor ruling party that adopted what he calls a co-optive response. It brought labor into the party. This was the Democratic Party under FDR, Roosevelt. In Canada, on the other hand, there was a hostile response from the ruling party that opposed incorporating labor organization into the political system. It's interesting, right? Now, it's paradoxical because you might assume, well, if in the United States they were welcomed, that should have strengthened them. And in Canada, because they were rejected and resisted, that should have weakened them. Okay? So the first comparison is a co-optive response by a ruling party, in this case, the Democratic Party of the United States, versus the coercive response from the ruling parties, Canada. Now, the result of this was that in the United States, labor is essentially defined as nothing more than another interest group among the many interest groups that have interests, demands, policy preferences, but there's a whole bunch of other interest groups. So just another interest group within the Democratic Party, right? In Canada, because it wasn't incorporated into the ruling parties, labor unions developed a much more class-conscious perspective on politics. So labor is an interest group in the US. In Canada, labor is a representative of the social class. This is critically important. And I am just scratching the surface of the importance of this in the context of his book. So he says the net result was that in the US, labor politics in the United States is framed as a pluralistic idea. We're going to talk about pluralism. The pluralistic idea, there's lots of different interests, there's lots of different groups. This group wants that, this group wants that. That organization prefers this policy. Just a part of the pluralist system. Okay. In Canada, it was framed in the context of the class idea. And that's part of the title of the book. The class idea that recognized that labor represents particular class interests. There are class divisions, and these are integral to politics. And so things are defined in class terms in Canada as opposed to the United States, where we tend to avoid any conversation of class except the middle class. And because it was rejected in Canada, because labor was rejected by the ruling parties, they developed their own labor progressive political party, which we do not have in the United States. That's the NDP, the New Democratic Party in Canada. So it was the historical incorporation of labor differently in the United States than Canada that has produced entirely different landscapes in the two countries with regard to the power of labor and the extent to which workers are actually represented by labor unions. All right, one final distinction, and that is between social unionism and economistic unionism. And this really reflects, I think, negatively on American unions generally, almost across the board. Social unionism is more of a broad kind of moral philosophy about the role of unions in promoting working class interests across the board, organizing workers everywhere, whether they're in your union or they're not, promoting progressive policies, universalistic policies that will support and advance the interests of the entire working class. That's called social unionism. There's been lots of debates in the United States among union leaders where you have rank and file workers who say our union needs to be connected to the larger struggles of workers in other industries, in other sectors of the economy. Economistic unionism is the typical form we have in the United States. It doesn't promote broad-based working class movements. It isn't really interested with developing and forming any kind of labor party or working class party, universalistic social program that will benefit all workers. The primary focus is advancing the economic interest of those members that they represent in that particular sector or that particular workplace. Economistic. What that means is that you're fighting purely for economic benefits for your workers. Social unionism, a much broader effort to promote progressive political economic policy across the board. Social unionism also in Canada is represented by the New Democratic Party. So they actually have a political instrument, organization that promotes that. Okay, let's respect the day with some thoughts about labor and workers and the struggles that they have been under and to continue. And we need to think about the importance of labor organization and political participation, and how, if we think about any kind of political economic changes in future, what role those organizations would play. And right now, they are very weak in the United States. And it's time we recognize that and do something about it. And I'm not sure either party is interested in that. We can say more about that in the context of what's happening in this current campaign. So I will end there. Thank you. I will see you next week.